Welcome to today's lecturette. I'm Dr. Leslie Jones, and today we're going to be exploring curriculum and pedagogical decisions that teachers and educators must consider as they intentionally work to support the development of children's wellbeing across physical, social and emotional wellbeing. To begin with, let's take a look at the curriculum foci around physical activity and wellbeing. As a community, we're becoming ever increasingly aware of the health risks of sedentary lifestyles and the impact on the overall well-being in both the short term and the long term. Like many other developed countries around the world, we have a growing issue with obesity and sedentary work environments, including recreational as well as educational settings. Recent data released from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare indicates a really concerning data set of 25% of children in Australia are overweight or obese. Left unaddressed, the health and wellbeing implications from this statistic will result in an increase in long-term health issues such as cardiovascular disease and diabetes, etc., as these children grow into adulthood. It is recommended that children between the ages of birth and 5 have access and engage with roughly 3 hours of light to vigorous physical activity per day, and older children accessing a minimum of 60 minutes of physical activity per day. The concerning issue is that while we have these guidelines, evidence is clearly starting to begin to suggest to us that our children in our local communities are not getting anywhere near this amount of physical activity, and the implications for their well-being are therefore very concerning. As we move through this lecturette, we're also going to be looking at the curriculum decisions that teachers and educators need to consider as they think about children's wellbeing, including physical activity and social and emotional wellbeing. If we consider the children who are accessing our early learning programs and centres, they should all have really ready access to outdoor learning environments where active play can be readily facilitated. However, recent research is indicating that this is in fact not the case. Rather, the data is suggesting that there is actually a decline in physical active play, and for many Australian children, they are not getting sufficient rigorous active play throughout the day to meet healthy guidelines. Exacerbating this is the concern over the increase in sedentary activities focused on technology and screen time. And you may well be aware that there's been a release of new recent guidelines that are attempting to provide educators and families about information about appropriate time spent both in active play, which, as I've just stated, for birth to 5 is about 3 hours of active play per day, and also the guidelines on screen time, minimising the amount of time that children are in front of screens to try to redress the imbalance that is clearly showing in the data about children's physical activity. You may recall from earlier lecturettes that we have spoken about some of the community-led programs in early learning centres to address AEDC results in targeted communities by providing activity programs and other social and emotional programs to specifically address the data that has been found in their particular community's results. However, I want to make the point that the most recent data around children's physical wellbeing would suggest that levels of inactivity and children's growing BMI levels and obesity and overweight concerns is a really broad population level issue that requires a pedagogical focus from educators and teachers for all children in all settings in all communities. Teachers and educators who purposefully plan active play for children to engage in are supporting the immediacy of the levels of vigorous activity required for physical health and well-being, but are also using proximal processes to role model and actively teach good life habits and behaviours about physical activity. This intentionality in curriculum decision is really essential to ensure that physical well-being for children is purposefully targeted and not just achieved by accident. In considering how we purposefully plan for active play for children from a wellbeing perspective, I think it's also worthwhile to talk about the tensions that exist between planning and supporting active play versus a very risk-averse attitudes that we still find within the sector, and understanding how those tensions actually play out and the sorts of things that educators have to consider in finding and striking the right balance. So the EYLF and the NQS have an embedded focus on children's physical development and the availability of natural resources and play environments for children. Natural elements in both indoor and outdoor settings where more risky play, physical play, can be explored is always juxtaposed to the risk-adverse environments where child safety is the primary consideration. Teachers and educators really have to learn how to negotiate this space in carefully considered ways and purposeful planning in order to satisfy both expectations. And we must also consider the burden from a regulatory perspective around reporting child accidents and incidents, and the very real exposure for many service operators around litigation from parents should children actually sustain an injury. The current regulatory environment, for good reasons, require notifications of child accidents and incidents and have an overwatch responsibility to ensure that children are in safe environments while they are in regulated care. However, the ECEC sector has long complained of the regulatory burden of operating early learning services in this country, including the reporting requirements for any and all physical incidents, even the most minor. It is understandable that service providers and educators weigh carefully the level of risk incorporated into physical activities against this paperwork and reporting framework and the government investigation processes that can often be involved if a child receives any form of injury. This produces a real-world tension for many educators and service providers as they balance the two agendas of encouraging active, risky play without compromising child safety. There are a growing number of examples illustrated in your text of innovations in pedagogy to support more risky and active play without compromising child safety. Examples from the early years of bush kindy and beach kindy are becoming more common in the sector, where children are intentionally taught how to safely negotiate these environments where real risks do actually exist. And of course, many primary schools are undergoing refurbishment and renovations in their playground environments to achieve learning environments where active play can be meaningfully engaged by young children in challenging yet safe ways. Skill-based learning, underpinned by a philosophy that acknowledges children's competencies, support the proximal processes needed to ensure that children leverage the benefits of these active play environments, and do so while building the requisite skills to self-regulate behaviour and keep themselves safe. Beyond excursions to support this type of play, every educator, regardless of what their actual environment contains, must begin to critically reflect on the active play they are planning for children and how to enhance the activity levels of children in meaningful and educative ways that keep children engaged and moving. I'd like us just to shift gears now and begin to look at the dynamic and aspects and curriculum decisions relevant to social and emotional wellbeing of young children. And to begin that discussion, I'd like us to think about the international focus, not just the local focus, around the importance of children's social and emotional wellbeing. We know that the benefits for children who are socially and emotionally competent are significant and well evidenced in the literature and research. The case for ensuring children's social and emotional development is a positive outcome is compelling and, not surprisingly, has become a focus for governments and institutions around the world. Social and emotional foci are an explicit outcome in many curriculum documents from around the world, including Early Head Start from the USA, the SEAL and SEED program from the UK, the Tafariki from New Zealand, and of course our own EYLF. All of these documents call out expectations for children's social and emotional wellbeing and development, and therefore present an implicit expectation that educators will have an intentional position on the planning and delivery of learning experiences geared to support children's social and emotional development. Structural considerations are also necessary. Things like peer groupings, resourcing, environmental setups are just some of the intentional decisions that must be considered to be able to optimise the learning environment geared around social and emotional learning. As educators and teachers begin to deeply critically reflect on these considerations, we can move beyond children gaining or not gaining experience in successfully negotiating the social world by accident to a genuine focus of intentional planning and teaching of social skills emotional literacy, including self-regulation of emotions and behaviours. In thinking about the importance of the planning considerations and curriculum decisions that teachers make, I think it's important to give some moment of thought around what is it that they actually have to decide to do and prioritise. And a significant body of research over a number of decades have highlighted the importance of peer friendships for children's wellbeing. And certainly peer group friendships is a huge focus around supporting children's social and emotional wellbeing. In general, we know that children who have close friendships have better self-esteem, levels of resilience, and are less lonely and socially isolated, and do better academically once they're in school. Conversely, children with poor peer group friendships struggle on all of these fronts. And worryingly, even very young children with low self-esteem or feelings of loneliness, or who may be already becoming socially isolated, are more susceptible to bullying and mental health issues such as anxiety and depression. Given these imperatives and the expectations embedded in curriculum frameworks, considering the pedagogical and curriculum decisions that teachers and educators must make is a naturally important consideration for them in their everyday working environment. Mindful teachers and educators purposefully plan their environments and learning experiences to support children's exploration of relationships, including concepts such as empathy, communication with others, and pro-social behaviours to support children's learning and the development of social competence. And these need to be embedded intentional aspects of the planning cycle used by teachers and educators. Another important aspect of the pedagogical and curriculum decisions that teachers need to consider in terms of supporting children's social and emotional wellbeing are the structural considerations, and these include things like finding the right balance between whole group and small group and individual learning experiences, and looking at the environment and setting up environments to include spaces and places for intimate relationships and communication between children in quiet places, as well as the spaces where children can collaborate and be big and loud and move together. The NQS unpacks the considerations for the physical layout and the resourcing of learning environments, and since 2012 many service operators have certainly improved the physical environment for children, including things like lots of natural elements and really focusing on creating a sense of warmth and calmness in their environments for young children. And there's been a significant in services and schools, I might add, to deinstitutionalise their classroom settings, making them feel more homely, making them feel places where children actually live and just not attend. In doing so, they have provided many more structural places for children to build more intimate relationships with peers. One of the most important pieces of teaching and learning that occurs for children in social and emotional wellbeing is that of self-regulation, and dealing with those big emotions, being able to regulate both emotions and behaviours is not only important work for children, but often work that educators spend an awful lot of time on and in many situations find quite stressful to deal with. But experiencing big emotions and difficulty in coping with social situations are all normal aspects of development for young children as they learn to negotiate the social world. Caring and empathetic adults, including teachers and educators and families, have a really critical role in scaffolding children's social learning and resilience in coping with frustrations and situations that they find overwhelming, and building the necessary social and emotional skills for healthy interactions with others. Many adults consider that the establishment of pro-social behaviour and emotional regulation just sort of happens. And to a point it's true. However, the learning organically is a result of a learning process, and often the learning that occurs is unintentional and unhelpful, resulting in children having limited abilities to self-regulate their own behaviours and emotions, and also learning poor social behaviours and what that actually achieves for them. Mindful teachers and educators ensure that they are planned and purposeful in providing the right types of learning environments to promote the development of positive self-regulation of behaviours and big emotions. Children who can self-regulate their behaviours and emotional responses in pro-social ways are better accepted by their peers and are able to make friends more easily and tend not to be socially isolated as children who end up labelled as behavioural children. So what are the curriculum decisions and planning considerations that teachers need to engage with to effectively support self-regulation? Supporting young children to negotiate the social world really does rely on very intentional planning for both individual children who may need more intensive support to be successful socially, and of course whole of group focus so that every child is actually learning the ropes on how to negotiate with one another. And some of the proximal processes that teachers and educators engage with include things like role modelling pro-social behaviours such as empathy, caring and gentle touch, and scaffolding social learning such as how to problem solve and how to negotiate conflict, and being able to share and turn take. And often this involves lots of external verbalisation of the teacher to step children through the process of what gentle touch may look like, for instance, or what sort of language do we use when we're trying to be empathetic to somebody else who might be in a bad spot for the day. And of course, they engage with things like role modelling and scaffolding emotional and pro-social vocabulary. So arming children with the necessary vocabulary to express those big emotions rather than act them out. And of course, the establishment of boundaries and expectations for behaviour in the rooms is an essential guidelines and guide rails for children and educators to be able to work together as a team event, actually, in rooms. All of these things are foundational curriculum considerations that educators and teachers must undertake to support children to learn how to self-regulate their own behaviours and their emotional responses. I wanted to take this opportunity to open a discussion on a very serious issue that teachers and educators face in educational settings in this country and pretty much around the world, I might add. And that of course, is the issue of bullying and children's wellbeing. And just to take a moment to think about the victim of bullying and the impact of bullying that has on individual children and the interventions that are required and necessary by educators and teachers to be proactive in that space. And of course, we understand that bullying encompasses the physical and psychological behaviours that are intentionally hurtful or harmful to another child and that are repeated over time, and importantly, establish a power over relationship between the bully and the victim. Bullying can be direct or indirect and can also include the bullying between the bully and the victim alone, or can also be expanded to include whole peer groups bullying against a single child. I'm very sure that all of us are aware of the community focus on bullying in all of its forms and the terrible consequences that can come about when bullying is not addressed effectively. The impacts of unaddressed bullying beyond the immediate anxiety and stress it causes for children and families can have a really devastating and cumulative cascade impact on the individual well into adulthood. Quite rightly, bullying has become a really serious community concern. And so as we consider bullying and teachers and educators' responses to making sure that bullying isn't occurring in their rooms, it's important to consider almost a call to action around how teachers and educators need to purposefully plan to ensure that they have the right sort of learning environment where bullying doesn't thrive. If teachers recognise that bullying can be both direct and indirect, teachers and educators need a heightened awareness of children who may be experiencing any form of bullying. And they need to have the requisite skills to address the immediate support for the individual child to stop the bullying. The research is really compelling, and educators and teachers who become aware of bullying simply must act to effectively support the individual child and to protect them from bullying at all costs. These considerations must obviously include the direct support for the child who is being bullied, but I also want to make the point that teachers and educators need to have a considered plan for the child who is doing the bullying beyond a punitive response. And I think that's really important if we think about swapping out toxic behaviours that bullies engage with and replacing it with pro-social, positive behaviours. There's an absolute requirement for that to be actively taught and intentionally delivered to that child. and a genuine focus on why the child has found bullying behaviours as a successful strategy to engage with peers must be considered. In addition to those considerations, however, teachers and educators and service providers and principals of schools must also examine the culture and the ecology of their settings for enabling or constraining conditions for bullying. Research has indicated that settings where there is a positive, empathetic culture, where children are positively engaged in their learning, bullying tends to be normally low. This highlights the importance of educators and teachers to genuinely and critically reflect on the culture and ethos of their setting. Where are the strong points that produce the right types of conducive environments, and where might there be areas and processes that need changing? Children's wellbeing is a critical focus in the curriculum. It requires teachers and educators to be aware of the imperatives of its development and the range of curriculum and pedagogical intentional decisions that must be a focus to support the development for individual children. There must also include a critical examination of the structural aspects of the environment and the proximal processes they include in their pedagogies and the overall ecology and culture of their setting. Thank you for joining me today as we've taken a brief look at this significant aspect of child wellbeing and the impact of curriculum decisions on overall child development. Thank you for joining me today as we've taken a brief look at some of these really significant aspects of child wellbeing and the impact on child development. I look forward to our next session together where we will begin our next topic in Module 1 about bringing policy into the practice environment and hooking together all of the concepts that we've discussed so far in Module 1.